Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have a deep dive into Social Security. Now, this is something that in the 7+ years that Choose FI has been around, we really haven't spent that much time on, even though it is of critical importance. And our guest today is Denis Shapiro, and he worked at the Social Security Administration for over 12 years. And he actually reached out to me from our FI weekly newsletter. Late last year, I had a little section where I copied and pasted some articles that I found on a Social Security deep dive. And he responded to me and said, "Hey, Brad, I worked at SSA for 12 years. If you're ever interested in doing an episode, I'd be all about it." And I instantly jumped on it. And this is the creation. So this is going to be a lot of fun and really critically important for those of us in the FI community that really don't even consider Social Security benefits in our FI number, to our great detriment, because many of us most likely are working months or years more than we have to and being ultra conservative and not considering something that is very, very important into our calculations. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Welcome to Choose FI. Denis, my friend, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Brad, thank you. The honor is all mine. I've literally listened to you guys a long, long time ago till now. Always follow along with the newsletter. So when I saw that blurb, I was more than happy to reach out and really happy that you took me up on my offer to be here.
Yeah. I mean, this is what the community is all about, right? There's so many intelligent people with subject matter expertise that goes way beyond anything that I could ever know, or Jonathan certainly. And this is crowdsourcing at its best. So thank you again. So, okay, let's dive into it. So, Social Security. Where would you start explaining Social Security to a FI community member who, frankly, might not even consider it at all?
So the first thing I would definitely say is Social Security is extremely broad, has a huge history going all the way back to the Great Depression. And a lot of the time it's very politicized, especially during political campaigns. It's very hard to figure out what is actually what. A lot of people are probably like, well, can you tell me something about Social Security? And they'll quickly say, well, it's running out of money. I'm never going to see it, right? Especially if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, let's say. So I think the first misconception that people had is that the money trouble that the government is in today is uniquely different than the money troubles that they were in from the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. The same thing kind of repeats itself. History kind of repeats itself. So the first thing we want to kind of mention about Social Security is for the people that don't think it's going to be there available for them in 20, 30 years, so they don't have to look at it now, they have to understand that I think it was in the 80s, literally Social Security was on the brink of dissolvency. There's multiple ways that Social Security gets expanded and increased in the future. So the likelihood is it will most likely be there. It is a hot button issue politically. So neither side, the right or the left, doesn't matter which political thing you're looking at, none of them want to make drastic changes because that's a very large voter base. So the first thing I wanted to kind of mention when we start talking about Social Security is that there is a good likelihood chance that it's going to be there, barring any really significant unforeseen events. And we could kind of go over some of the reasons why I think it will strongly be there. And some of it's just the way that the Social Security benefits are derived and what formula is actually used. And when you realize that with a very small adjustment to the formula, it adds like a decade to the longevity of Social Security. So just to mention that is the first thing is there's a lot of misconceptions out there. Secondly, there's a very good chance that even if you're in your 30s, that you are going to see and you're going to reap the benefits of Social Security in some shape or form when you are approaching your 60s.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And of course we can never prognosticate of what's going to happen in the political reality. Of course, that's not the game we're playing here, but like you said, this is kind of a third rail of politics, and to imagine that Social Security is going to entirely disappear is just so outside of the realm of possibility that, like, if you were a betting person, you'd say it's well less than a tenth of 1% that it is going to disappear entirely. I think most people, when they hear, oh, Social Security is going bankrupt or insolvent, that sounds catastrophic. But everything that I've read suggests that kind of a worst case scenario is maybe 70% of current benefits. And again, not prognosticating, don't hold me to that. I'm not saying that's a guarantee. That is just what experts that I've read say. So, okay, if you want to plan, hey, what am I going to get? The Social Security Administration is saying it's going to be $3,000 a month. Well, maybe take 70% of that. So obviously, Denis, I don't want to put words in your mouth there, but that's what I've heard. And like you said, there are some interesting ways that maybe based on how benefits are derived, right? With the wage cap, I imagine talking the age you can retire, some minor little adjustments produce some pretty significant results. But I guess before we even get into that, and I do want to ask you specifically about that, at a real broad level, what pays for Social Security? And is it like its own separate accounting as far as the government's concerned? Or is it all just kind of part and parcel of the same pot of overall tax revenue?
So that's a good question. So I used to get that question a lot when I interviewed people for their retirement benefits or disability benefits. A lot of that's misconception. So there are different trust funds. One of the trust funds is paid out of your wages. So that is the old age survivor disability insurance. It's the OASDI taxes that get taken out. I believe it's something like 4.8% most recently. I got to double check that number. Yeah, it's 4.8, and then Medicare is, well, I think 1.4. But combined, I think it's like 6.4%. And the other trust fund is the trust fund that takes care of SSI, which is supplemental securities income. The big confusion is that supplemental securities income is also administered by the Social Security Administration. So there's regular Social Security benefits, which is usually associated with your retirement and your disability benefits off of benefits that you work from. And then there's SSI benefits, where it's kind of the needs based program of the federal government. There's a lot of confusions about both. The regular Social Security benefits are based off your OASDI deductions, and then the other benefits, the welfare benefits, which is only a fraction of the total administration costs as the regular Social Security benefits. Those are just taxed regularly at the end of the year, and it's not the OASDI benefits. So a lot of people are confused about that, but that's a drop in the bucket from the regular larger benefits.
So, okay, those are certainly important to know. And then in terms of the actual, let's say, FICA tax, so that pays for the vast majority of Social Security and Medicare, right? So that's what, 7.65% total? That's what the payroll taxes are. And it's, if I recall it correctly from my accounting days, it's 6.2% of that is Social Security and 1.45 is Medicare. Does that sound about right?
That sounds right. So Social Security is about 6.2%, and then Medicare is 1.45 on top of that. So it's only a fraction percentage. A lot of people think like, oh, I'm paying so much in taxes because they're looking at the total number. People don't understand that it gets partitioned off and only a fraction of that. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, where, they'll come in and they only make, let's say, 20, 30, $40,000 a year. And at the end of the year, they're shocked at how low their Social Security benefits is because only a fraction of that. So, for example, if you make $100,000 a year, only 6,200 of that is going towards the Social Security kind of bank. So, if you factor that in, your rate of return is actually surprisingly high when you factor in that only 6.2% of that actually goes. And then there was a period in the last 10 years that they actually reduced that to 4.8 as part of the stimulus package.
Okay.
So that's where people are really surprised at how much actually goes in to the system from taxes.
Interesting. Okay. And so, right, that I know from being a small business owner. So, if you're just a W 2 employee, and I don't mean just, but if you are a W 2 employee, you pay that employee side of 7.65, but there's also an employer side, whether you're employed or you're self employed. If you're self employed, you're paying both sides of it. You get an additional deduction for, I think, one half of it, but it's really 15.3 in totality. Is that right?
I believe so. So I'm looking at the OACI tax rate for self-employed is 12.4. And then there's Medicare on top of that. So you're right in totality. Yeah.
Gotcha. I'm curious, Dennis. So, like you said, basically, we're putting in 6.2% of our income into Social Security, and the rate of return actually winds up being pretty reasonable. Is there any way that like a normal person could calculate what their rate of return is? I think a lot of us think like, oh man, I'm just throwing money away into this bottomless pit. I mean, I don't think this obviously, but I think a lot of people bemoan like, oh, I wish I could invest it myself in a 401k or something. Like, is there any way to run that horse race, or is that just something that's way too convoluted to even try?
No, so if you go on the Social Security website, ssa.gov, and you sign up, they'll give you pretty accurate estimates of what you would actually be looking at. And then it's just a simple break even calculation. And they'll tell you exactly, like on your Social Security statement, it'll tell you exactly what you put in. So you could kind of do the numbers. Like if you've put in, let's say 150,000 and you're getting, let's say $1,500 a month, your break even is going to be 10 years. And it's really important to note that the way that the formulas is designed, it is weighted heavily on lower to middle income. Because think about it, the highest you can get in Social Security, I forgot what it was. When I left the agency, I think it was like 3,300 a month or something like that. I could look up the exact amount, but that's the highest you could get on a monthly benefit at your full retirement age. However, if you've worked for a fraction of that, sometimes you could get 12, 13, 14, $1,500 a month. So you've paid in probably a third or fourth or fifth less, but you're only going to get half less. The system was designed in a way to skew the lower income and the middle income to getting higher benefits, and then to take from the higher income and give them kind of the lower benefits.
Okay. So, right, this truly is a social safety net. That was the intention of it. So, that makes intuitive sense to me. Right. So, okay, there is a maximum amount that you can get every month. And obviously, I have to assume that changes every single year. And that's something we can do with a quick Google search.
It's 36.27 a month. So today is 36.27 for someone who takes that full retirement age. If someone who delays it till 70, which we could kind of get into the different options, it's 45.55.
Okay, gotcha. And yeah, we definitely are going to spend some time talking about those different options of when you should actually pull the trigger and start collecting benefits, because I think that's something that's critical and most people have no comprehension. But as I understand it, the way the calculation works, it's based off of your 35 years of, I guess, the highest income earning years you have. Now, there's some potential complications for people in the FI community who potentially might have either significantly lower income in their 50s and 60s, maybe even 40s if they pull the trigger, right? Or potentially no income, right? If they reach a financial independence number and actually pull the trigger on the retire early. How do we think about that? Like, okay, what's the actual impact going to be?
It's funny that you mentioned it's such a great question, because the name of the game, right, at least when I was heavily in the FI community, was you pay as little taxes as possible so you could invest as much as possible, right? So I remember one year my W-2, like I made six figures, but after maxing out my 401k, maxing out my IRA, maxing out my FSA, my HSA, it was like, and like my tax rate was less than 10%, right? But then you get to a point where, let's say you end where I leave, and I'm in this situation now. I had over a decade of six-figure income, and now I'm going to potentially be looking at a decade to the next 20 years to kind of claiming a lot less taxes, because I'm a self-employed business person who gets to write off a lot more and all of that stuff. So there's a couple really important things to understand. One, the first and the most obvious is that you're going to get a smaller Social Security check, but it's not the end of the world, because just if you're investing, if you're maxing out your 401k and all the thing, you're truly realizing the purpose of Social Security. And this purpose of Social Security is never to have been the only safety net you have. The analogy they're using when the government kind of describes Social Security, it's a part of the leg to the stool. And it's not supposed to be the main thing that's holding you up. So as long as you're doing the other part of your stool correctly, and you have the 401k and you have other passive income and all of that stuff, then you could get a minimal amount from Social Security and you're going to be completely fine. So the first thing I just want to kind of get out there is that there's no ways to really trick the system into a higher benefit. But as long as you have 10 years of working history, you are going to collect something from Social Security. So that's really, really important. The other big thing that I want to say is, if you leave your W-2, and then a lot of people in the Choose Fight, they kind of get to all the things that been on the post burner, right? They catch up on their Netflix binging, but they go travel and they do everything that they've been holding back because they've been working so hard to get into FI. If they spend the next 2 years at zero, the really important thing that I want to get out there is that you are actually still qualified for what's called your disability insurance benefits. When you pay your OASDI, the D in the OASDI is disability insurance. So a lot of people don't understand that. So they might have retired from their job, self-retired, but let's say in 2 years they get hurt. There's actually a 5-year window right there where they still have insurance through Social Security, and they could qualify for disability insurance. Now, the interesting part about disability insurance, and this might be the most important thing I say during this podcast, is if you're approved for your disability amount, your disability amount is equivalent to what you would get if you waited till your full retirement amount.
Oh,
So
wow.
let's say you're 35 years old. You stop working for whatever W-2 you do. You go travel for 2 years. You're perfectly healthy. God forbid you get diagnosed with an illness or whatever the situation is. Just because you left your job, and I really want to say this twice, just because you left your job perfectly healthy doesn't mean that you won't qualify for disability insurance if something happens to you after the fact as long as it happens to you within that 5 year period.
Interesting. Now, what's like the broad definition of something happening to you in that scenario? Because I don't think most people even understand what they could qualify. Like, I think you understand intuitively, hey, I'm doing this job that requires me to be physically able and I can't do it anymore. So then I would get disability. But when you're not working, what would factor into that?
So the way Social Security defines disability is your ability to perform what they call substantial gainful activity. So as long as you're no longer able to perform that substantial gainful activity due to a physical ailment, it can't just be saying, "Well, I'm not working, so I'm going to file for disability." So as long as there's some kind of ailment, and it could be physical or mental, which is very, very important, that's stopping you from performing your substantial gainful activity. Now they're going to take into a factor, the younger you are, the more difficult it is to get approved for disability. That's just a fact. But they're going to take into consideration education. So if you have a PhD and you turn around and you say, well, I don't want to, I don't know, count buns, let's say. Well, they're going to say, well, you have a PhD. There's a million other things you can do. But the point is, if you can't physically work, let's say you get hit by a bus. I hate to be so cliche about it. Let's say you get hit by a bus and you're stuck in a hospital room or whatever the situation is, and you physically can't get up and you can't type, so you can't work remotely. You could qualify for disability benefits, and the amount that you would get is the same amount that if you waited till 60, your full retirement age, because that changes for people. So it's really, really important that it can be a significant benefit in that situation. And not only for them, but the younger you get approved for disability, the more likely you have young children. And there's then family benefits kick in, which is a whole different topic, which I want to get to with the FI community. So there's multiple things. And that's why sometimes I'm a little careful of not going into too many different rabbit holes here. But whatever you want to kind of take the conversation, let me know.
No, I like the rabbit holes, and I suspect that we're going to have to do a part two and part three on this. So if you're game, for anybody out there, you're going to have probably a million questions on this. We just can't cover it all in one podcast, obviously. So just hit reply to my newsletter, just like Dennis did to make this episode happen in the first place. So if you're not on the newsletter, chooseof.com/subscribe and literally hit reply to it every Tuesday. And I read every single one of these replies. So send in your questions. We'll do a part two, just source from those questions. And I suspect there are going to be a couple other rabbit holes that we have to dive down into. So, Dennis, I'm curious. So, as a small business owner, basically, the earnings that go on your Social Security statement, are they just based on W 2 earnings? Is it like if you're an owner of a flow through company, like a S Corp or something, and you get earnings from the business, but it's not paid out as W 2 wages? Does that get included in? Do 1099 workers, of which there are obviously many tens of millions, does that amount end up on Social Security? Like, I guess A, that question, but then B, the second part is like, if it does get included, like, how do you kind of audit and make sure that everything's being captured, most importantly?
So that part is really easy. If you go on ssa.gov, you sign up for my Social Security account. You should do it every year as like a good practice, and you should be able to see the amount. Now, what amount you should be expected to see, that's a different story. So the easy one is obviously if you have a W-2, the W-2 gets reported to the IRS then posts it to your Social Security. That's as easy as it gets. Now, it does get more complicated for people who are self-employed. Now, a lot of people get this confused, but at the end of the day, there are different tax rates, and the way that those self-employment wages are filed, that's a very personal situation between you and your CPA. But at the end of the day, if a Schedule SC is produced, in that Schedule SC, it's going to document how much Social Security wages, how much the OASDI is taken out. And as long as there's no number produced, let's say your CPA says we're just going to pay it out as dividends this year, as distributions, and it's not going in as wages, then it's not wages. So people get so confused with that because they think they're paying, and according to the CPA, they're paying. But at the end of the day, they really have to understand the schedules that are going into their tax returns, because if there's no Schedule SE, nothing's then flowing through to your Social Security benefits.
Okay. All right. So that is the key. It's the Schedule SE on your 1040. So,
Yep.
right, like you said, this should be an annual to do that I know I'm going to put in Todoist is look at my prior year's tax return, Schedule SE, line it up, go to ssa.gov, log in. I just did this. I created I think it's like a login.gov, like overall account. You just log in and you can very quickly see what the government has down as your wages or earnings for the prior year and frankly for your entire working lifetime, which is actually pretty cool to look at for the first time.
It is. It's really cool. If anybody's ever writing a autobiography, I strongly recommend that they pull that out because it'll give them a lot of memories of what they did when. It won't give you the name of the location of where it will just say dollar amount. But here's a fun fact: if you actually go to the Social Security Administration, you could order what's called a detailed earnings query, and they will give you a breakdown of every employer you worked for that time
Oh,
period.
wow.
So if you're ever doing an autobiography and you need to figure out time and places of where you were, that can be super helpful, and the cost is pretty minimal for it.
Huh. That's very cool. Yeah, I have to say it was kind of like a trip down memory lane because I looked at like, oh wow, the summer of 1998, I had $0 of earnings because that was the summer I studied abroad in Japan. I was like, oh wow, that actually makes sense. Or oh, this was my first job in X year 2002, and that was my first real wages. So yeah, it actually was just as like a fun exercise. It was pretty neat. But yeah, like we said, that should be something that everybody leaves here and says, all right, this is something I have to do at least once a year, and you should have that login, right? Like each adult should have a login to ssa.gov. Real simple, right, Dennis?
Yep. And also, just when you're doing your taxes or you're doing your own taxes, it's not always about what produces the lowest taxable amount. Figure that out, because if you have a choice and you are performing self employment, sometimes it's just better to pay the little bit of higher taxes. But what it does is every time you do pay a year of self employment, as long as it's not minimal amount, as long as it's, let's say, even 10, 15, $20,000, what that will do is they'll keep your insured status for those disability benefits. So keep that in mind. So if you stop working at 32, you go away for 2 years, fine. You come back at 35 and you have a renowned passion to do your own business. At that point, when you're filing your taxes, when you're having those conversations with a CPA, some of those questions should be more about, well, let's not figure out how to pay the least taxes. How do I pay some self-employment so I could keep that insured status going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting how there's always this give and take of we do obviously want to, within what's legal and allowed, we want to, in theory, lower our tax liability. But there are some areas where, okay, it actually makes sense to show a little bit extra of taxable income or tax liability. So just having this knowledge, I think that again is another thing I hope that everybody leaves here with is just having this knowledge like, all right, this is another factor you need to consider when you're doing all of these things, right? Like my premiums for health insurance. That's another thing where income factors in. So you just need to be cognizant of all of this. And there truly is a give and take.
Yeah, for sure. And Brad, I just wanted to get out there that's really, really important is that I am in no shape or form affiliated with Social Security. I did retire at the end of 2022 and started my own consulting business for Social Security, but in no way this information that I am providing to the community in any shape or form, endorsed by or affiliated with the actual Social Security Administration.
Okay. Yeah, that's really important. I'm glad you said that. But like we said at the outset, you did work there for 12 years. So I
Yep.
think it's fair to say you're a subject matter expert. But yeah, you absolutely do not work there any longer. So that's critical.
Yeah, I
We
don't want this to be constituted as the government's telling them
no, no,
to
no, no.
file for self-employment,
No.
everything like that.
You are just listening to a podcast with two people chatting about something, and yeah, there's no expertise, no financial advice here. We're just we're doing the best we can, certainly. And Dennis, I did want to just dive into something that you said is really the most important thing that people leave here with, which is this disability insurance. And I got to be honest, I had never heard of this. The absolute first time this has ever crossed my plate is right now. So I guess what's really important that people understand is A, this exists as part of the federal government and ultimately the larger umbrella of your Social Security benefits. Now, I guess if you are no longer employed, like you said, up to 5 years after, there's the potential for these disability benefits. Now, this might be a distinction without a difference, but I'm curious anyway. What if you are employed? I think most people think like, oh, there's disability through their job. But do you still have the ability to get this disability insurance through the federal government?
So it goes back to the same question of how disability is defined, and its definition is the substantial gainful amount, and it's an actual dollar amount. So it changes every year, but as of right now, it is 2460 for a blind individual and 1470 for a non-blind individual.
And that's per month?
Per month, yes. So in theory, if you are disabled but still working and you're making, let's say, 1450, you can apply for disability. Again, it's a hardest sell because you're telling. So interesting fun fact is who actually makes the medical decision. It's not actually Social Security. The Social Security works with the state agencies of that specific state. So if you file in Virginia, It's actually Virginia's disability determination services that are going to make that actual determination. They wanted to create a clear line in the sand. So, for example, if you live in New York, New Jersey, you have the disability determination service for each state. Now, once your case gets sent up, you're making that argument that you can't physically work. So it's a hard argument to make when you're making 1460 and the threshold is 1470, because it's, the person who's making the decision is just going to look at that and say, well, there's not much difference here. So they're
Right.
just
Come
going to
on.
find them not disabled. So I think it's very, very important. Also understand that the blind is significantly more. And also understand that number, the SGA number, is not hard and true. And what that means is there are reasons why we would discount wages. So, for example, let's say someone's making $2,000 a month and is working as a secretary or an executive assistant, whatever you want to say, and they get diagnosed with cancer. And their boss, the lawyer, feels terrible for this person. So the lawyer goes, come in one day a week, make me a cup of coffee, schedule some meetings for me. You could go home and I'll continue paying your salary. Now, what that does is that's called a work subsidy. So as long as the lawyer confirms that she's only doing 20% of the job or 30% job or 50% job, we then take the actual amount she makes and we actually multiply by that factor, and that number can bring it down. So let's say in this our example, the secretary makes $2,000 a month and the lawyer is confirming that she gets a 50% subsidy. Now we take that 50% times it by 2,000. Now we're at $1,000 a month. The SGA level is only 1470. All of a sudden now this person is below the SGA threshold. So subsidies are huge and a lot of people aren't familiar with it. And sadly, a lot of representatives that are taking your claims are actually not 100% familiar with it. So it can be easily swept under the rug, but it's a very, very powerful tool. The other big thing is called income related work expenses, IRWEs. And the easiest way to say that is, let's say someone has a wheelchair and the cost to upkeep that wheelchair costs them $500 a month. And without upkeeping that wheelchair, they can't go to work. So if they make $1,500 a month and now you take the $500 of the wheelchair expenses and now you bring down the earnings to $1,000. So a good representative, the way that they're trained, is supposed to actually get to the bottom of the real earnings. However, unfortunately, and this is one of the reasons why I kind of left the agency, is that you get assigned numerous amount of cases in one day. You're looking at your caseload. And then when you're doing your disability claim and you're dealing with that intake, you hear, oh, $1,700. Okay, this is a denial. The person's working over SGA. Click, click, click. You'll get a notice. Have a good day. I got to get to my next claim. So that's really, really important. And this is something that I do want to get out to the audience, is that just because you hear it from a representative doesn't mean it's actually factual. You have to understand that there are these ways to bring down your earnings. So just because you're working doesn't mean you're automatically not entitled to disability. It just means there's more evaluation that's needed. And the more you're familiar with some of these basics, there's not 1,000 of them, but income related work expenses is a big one. And that's a lot of the medications that people pay for out of pocket can be considered a income related work expense. The subsidies is another big thing. So these are really big things that a regular representative, and I'm not saying there's some great representatives out there, but I would say 2 out of 10 times it will be missed. And it's a high audit finding after the fact because they'll not catch it a lot of times. So just to be mindful, just because you're working doesn't mean you don't qualify for disability. There are these different ways of breaking down your earnings, such as income related work expenses and the subsidies. So just keep that in mind for the audience.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Okay. So that's something important. Again, just to be mindful of. This may not come to pass for that many of us, obviously, but just that it's there in your mind as something to be even aware of. And I think that would be a win walking away from this episode for sure. So I guess just going back, and I really want to dive into when to claim it, how to maximize Social Security. I think that's the real meat here for most people. But just the final thing on how Social Security benefits are calculated. So as I understand it, there are a minimum number of basically work credits. So I guess it's like 40 work credits that you earn 4 per year. So it's just a fancy way of saying you need 10 years of work history to qualify, right? So
Yep.
now you've reached that threshold, but then again, like we talked about before, it's calculated on the 35 highest years that you have. So the minimum threshold is 10, and then anything above that presumably increases your potential benefits until you get to that cap that we talked about. There is a maximum amount. So this is really a program for middle class, lower middle class people, certainly. So there is that maximum, right? But Dennis, is there anything else we need to consider, like as part of these work credits or anything else? Like, what about people who were stay at home parents who potentially don't have those 10 years? Like, is that just a hard and fast, okay, if you don't have 10 years, there's no help? Or how do we think about that?
Really great question. And Brad, I think your understanding of the situation is actually quite excellent. Let's give a scenario of if someone's worked for 10 years and then they don't work another day in their lives, right? How is their earnings record going to look like? So it's a 35-year formula. So you're going to have obviously the 10 years that you've worked will be the 10 years. And assuming that all 10 years qualify for credits. So it is important to note there is a minimum for these credits. So quarters of coverage. For 2024, a quarter of coverage is 1730. So as long as you have 1730, and that's also important to keep in mind for self-employment because it's the same quarter of coverage. So if someone turns around and says, well, how could I have not gotten my 10 years of credits? I made $3,000 or 3,400, whatever it is. The reason is because there is a minimum amount for a quarter of coverage.
Okay, so wait, the 4 credits. So is that basically looking at it as like a quarter of a year? Is that what you mean?
Yep.
Gotcha.
And it doesn't have to. So if you work in January and you earn the 8,000, you've earned your 4 credits. It's just they won't be credited to you until
Gotcha.
this is,
Gotcha.
I don't know, side note if you want to get into it, but a lot of times, let's say someone has 39 work credits, they'll come in and we could actually file the claim for the next quarter to start. So let's say, we are in July, but we need to wait till October 1st to actually give him the credit. So there's a lot of nuances when it comes to that. But yes, that is quarters of coverage are earned throughout the year, but it can only be credited for one specific quarter, but it doesn't have to be earned in that quarter, if that makes sense.
Okay. And you said it was 1730. So that means what, 6920 per year. $6,920 would be that 1730 times 4.
Correct.
So if you earn more than that, then you earn your 4 credits for that calendar year. Is that fair?
Correct. You just earn your 4 credits, right? You can never earn more than 4 credits in 1 year.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. So like when I looked at my list of earnings history going way back to when I was like 17, I have like $100, 200. I don't even know where that came from, frankly, but that would get me nothing. So those are more or less zeros, or am I misunderstanding?
You're misunderstanding because you're not factoring in COLA. So your
Oh,
$200 in I don't want to date you, let's say 1995,
yeah, we'll say
is
that.
not really $200 because if you COLA adjusted for inflation, that might have got you a credit or two.
Huh.
If you go on the Social Security website, it actually goes all the way back to when the program basically started, what a credit, what the number actually comes in. So it is
Interesting.
inflation adjusted. Just to give you a sense, in 2023, the quarter of coverage was 1640. So, it's like a $90 difference between the two. So it is significant because if the COLA
That
is
is pretty
8%,
significant.
now I've been at Social Security for a period where there was a 2-3 year period where the inflation was supposedly zero and the quarters of coverage stayed the same. Everything stayed the same for 3 years. It was like a time capsule, like it was frozen. And then the last 2-3 years before I left, it was heavy inflation. And you see these numbers just jump.
Gotcha. Okay. This is really, really interesting. Yeah, I would not have even factored in that COLA. So that's yet another thing that we need to be cognizant of. So, Rick, going back to maybe stay-at-home parent or some such, like, is it just if you're under those 40 credits, like what happens then?
So there's a couple of things. So one, this is where people don't really understand is that the program was actually designed in an era of a one working parent household. So there's a whole sequence of benefits called spouse benefits where you're getting half of what your spouse is going to get as long as you're married for more than 10 years. So those are kind of the nuances you kind of have to figure out because yes, if a stay-at-home spouse ends up getting divorced in 9 years and then they personally don't go ahead and work somewhere else for a significant time period, they're not going to be entitled to anything. So it's all about, how long were you married to someone? Will you be eligible for spouse benefits? And we've had some funny situations. In my career, I did close to probably over 1,000 retirement claims. We've had situations where they came in and the spouse was not insured herself and she was only married for 9 years. And she was like, well, the divorce stipulation says I get a Social Security benefits. Well, I was like, divorce stipulation doesn't change Social Security laws of the thing. Because once I put in that the marriage is 9 years, the system itself calculates the denial. There's a denial code for all of this thing. So there's nothing I could turn around and say, well, no, we're going to give credit for another year, whatever it is. And honestly, a lot of divorce lawyers kind of know this. And if people are in that 9-year bucket, and if that marriage is going bad, that might sometimes be that little incentive to get them over to the divorce line. Is like, all right, if I get divorced in the next 11 months, my wife gets screwed or husband gets screwed, whatever it is, vice
Right.
versa. I've seen situations like that left and right.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah, okay, that is fascinating. So, right, like you said, there's nothing you can do in the sense that, oh, maybe they had 4 working credits and then these 9 years of marriage. It's not additive, what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah.
This is like hard and fast rule of, okay, you had to be married. So, I guess what you're saying though is, let's say someone is married for 13 years and they didn't work during that time and they hadn't worked, they just couldn't get to those 40 credits, right? Let's just assume they're well under that, but they were married for 13 years, but happened to get a divorce. And then it's, let's say even a couple decades later, they still are entitled to 50%, you said, of the
It could
spouse.
be depend. Yes. So it'd be the divorce spouse benefits. Those are the benefits that they would be entitled
Yeah.
to in that situation. It does depend. The 50% is if they took it at full retirement age. It does get reduced if they're taking it early itself. So that does play a role in that situation. And then there's divorced widows benefits as well. So there's a lot of
Oh,
different
wow.
rabbit holes. But the point is, if you are a stay-at-home spouse, there's a lot of different options. And by the way, let me just clarify when I said about the marriage being 10 years. If you're
Yeah.
currently married, that doesn't apply. You don't need a 10-year requirement at that point. This is for people who are, let's say, there is a minimum requirement. I believe it's 2 years that you have to be married for at least 2 years to qualify. But the point is, you don't have to be married for 10 years. But if you do get divorced, your marriage needed to have lasted for 10
Okay.
years to qualify, unless the marriage ended at death. And then that's a whole different situation.
Okay. Right. Yet another rabbit hole
Yeah.
that, yeah, there are way too many rabbit holes to dive into in one podcast episode. But yeah, that's hugely helpful. So, okay, right. So they are not like tethered to that ex spouse. So it's not like they need to get in touch with them or anything. It's just, okay, this is what I'm entitled to. They're working with the Social Security Administration, right? So it's just that you are entitled to those benefits if you had married for 10 years and you're subsequently divorced. So, okay, that is really, really helpful. And since we're now talking about, all right, maybe starting to take Social Security, right? And you said like your full retirement age, you're maybe early or whatever it is. Okay, so let's get into the when to claim Social Security and how to maximize, because I think this is something people really want to hear about in this episode. And then, like we said, we'll do part 2, part 3, whatever down in the future. But when to claim Social Security, I think that's just I'm going to leave it there and not not ask too many specific questions because you're the expert. So why don't you just run with that?
So the first thing I kind of want to get out there is that Social Security filing strategies has gone incredibly less complicated since the time I started with agency and when I left the agency. When I started the agency in 2010, there was so many different strategies of how to maximize earnings. And I'll kind of go over some of them that don't exist just to give you guys a frame of reference. So what would happen a lot of times is that one spouse would file their benefits. They would then have their wife come out on to their benefits. So the wife would start getting half. They would then suspend their benefits so that theirs can grow. And then later on, they would switch over to theirs at 70, but their wife collected the whole times. So it was called file and suspend benefits. All of
Okay.
that is out the window. So as of right now, it's really, really simple. So when you file, the earliest you can file is basically at 62 years old. The big contingency on filing at your early retirement is A, are you okay with the reduction? The reduction is significant. It is on a monthly basis. So when you go into Social Security, you could ask for what's called your benefit matrix, and they will literally give you every single month what your benefits would look like if you filed. So whether or not you filed in July or August or September, it's a really simple formula. It's an 8% annualized formula broken down on a monthly basis. But A, if you're filing at 62, are you okay with the reduction? B, now this is the big one, is just because you're filing for retirement doesn't mean you're actually retired from your W-2 job or self-employment or vice versa. So if you have not actually retired from your day job, you are subject to what they call an annual earnings test. And that number is really important. Let me get that number for you guys. The annual earnings test in 2024 is $22,320 a year. So basically, what that means is that if you're working over that amount and you claim for your Social Security benefits, you're actually going to get penalized for $1 for every $2 over that limit, which is
Oh, wow.
significant. So that is what you need to know when you're filing early. Then the next important milestone is 65, because at 65, you could claim your Medicare. But a lot of people confuse just because you claim your Medicare as that's their full retirement age. It is not. That is 65. That is a very, very different rabbit hole we could kind of get into.
Can I just interject real quick
Yes.
right there? So the Social Security side is an actual decision, right? So it's 62, 67, potentially 70 or later, and you're going to get different payouts based on when you actually decide to make that claim. Now, talk me through the 65 for Medicare. Is that a similar decision of, hey, I'm potentially foregoing something, or is it just like a hard and fast, like, hey, I'm 65, I can use this, it's time to start claiming?
No, this is definitely a different rabbit hole, but I'll keep it a really high level. So, what people don't understand is Medicare is not Social Security. Social Security and Medicare are two different agencies, but for some reason, I guess someone in Congress or whatever, a lot higher pay grade than me, decided that it would be a genius idea for Social Security to be the face and take basic enrollments for Medicare to process Medicare, because there isn't no such thing as you going into a Medicare office to file your Medicare benefits. So Social Security got intertwined with basically filing for Medicare. And there's four parts of Medicare. Part A, which is hospital. It's otherwise associated as hospital insurance, HI. That's the, what word am I looking for? Acronym. Yeah, hospital insurance, HI. SMI is part B, which is supplemental medical insurance. That's your outpatient visits. That's if you're going to go to your local primary care, etc. That's part B. Part C is your different plans, like your Aetnas and all of that stuff. And then part D is prescription. So with Social Security, you're really only dealing with A and B. A, as long as you got 10 years of coverage of those quarters of coverage, your high monthly benefit premium is actually zero. So you're not paying anything for it. So it's a really hard case to ever say like why it doesn't make sense to file at 65. You usually always take at least part A. Now, SMI is a whole different story because SMI has a monthly premium amount is $174.70. So that's the one where it's not an easy decision, but that decision is going to be based on if you currently have insurance through active employment. Now, be very careful of, I didn't say through your active employment. I just said through active employment. So if your wife is working and you're covered through her insurance and she's physically working, you're fine. You could actually delay getting SMI and you delay then paying that $174 a month because you're getting similar coverage through your wife's insurance or your insurance. Depends if you're actually physically working. Now, really important, Affordable Care Act does not count. COBRAs don't count. So it literally has to be insurance through active employment. And as long as you meet that, you could delay that monthly premium. But if you don't meet that, and I'm assuming most fiery members won't meet that because they've been doing Affordable Care Act or what are the different health insurance strategies, they probably are going to want to file as quick as possible because that's probably a great rate for them, the $174 a month to cover outpatient. So between your hospital stays and your outpatient, you're getting pretty good insurance. And then there's part C and D.
Yeah, for $174 a month.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay, so that's part A and part B. And then, yeah, just real quick, C and D, just to close out Medicare.
C is the supplemental. You don't actually need to get it. That is like if you want to get United Healthcare, Medicare.
Okay.
So there sometimes is your supplemental or advantage plans. They both kind of fall into that C. You could go to different Medicare agencies that kind of sell it. But those are the ones you're also getting when you're turning 65, or if you have a parent who turns 65, you're getting thousands of brochures of these different plans. AARP is a really, really big one. So you're getting kind of bombarded, but you don't actually need it. You could just turn around and stay with A and B. Like when I always explained it to people that were filing, A and B is your general, you're going to go to a hospital, it's going to be covered. B is going to be covered outpatient. However, if you have diabetes or a specific health condition where it won't fit nicely into B, where you'll have a lot of outpatient expenses or something like that, there might be a supplemental plan that kind of has that focus. And then it may make sense for you to get that supplemental insurance plan directly through Aetna or United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the whole nine.
Okay, that all makes sense. And right, like you said, D is prescription drugs. And yeah, so that I think that covers Medicare. And it sounds like, and again, we're not giving advice here, but it sounds like, all right, you hit 65, it's time for Medicare. So it doesn't seem like there's a massive decision there, which is important. But then just going back to the actual Social Security benefits, so this is where there is truly a decision. And like you said, and it's a very heartening thing to hear that it's a lot less complicated now. It actually sounds like from when you started way back when in 2010, it was a lot more convoluted. And now it just, to me, and I would love to hear you respond to this, it sounds like it is just you're looking at a chart and my payout benefits are X per month. If I start collecting at 62, they're Y per month. If it's this age, whatever, 65, 67, 70, like it changes and there are different points. So, A, is that loosely accurate? Are there additional considerations? And is it every subsequent year after 62, or are there threshold points where it's 62, 67, 70, or do you get more if it's 63 as opposed to 62?
So every month you wait from 62 till 70, it is more based on the 8% annualized return. It is that simple unless there are additional considerations. And the additional considerations, in like in life, it's that gray area. The gray area is if you're a widow. Remember, I was describing that file and suspend strategy. That file and suspend strategy has not been taken away from widows. So if you are a widow at 62, you could actually go ahead and claim your deceased spouse's benefits, collect that till 70, and then switch over to the maximum amount that you can get at 70. So those are those kind of considerations where, and this is when you need to, when you're talking to your Social Security representative and you're taking that claim, you really hope that they're doing that. Like they're supposed to have a due diligence checklist of addressing a lot of these type of potential benefits. Unfortunately, a lot of that time it's missed. And that's where those nuances add complications. But yes, if you're not a widow, it's a simple, when does it make sense? And I'll give you guys a hint. It's usually a 12 to 15 year formula. So it's usually, if I don't take it today, I'm going to have to wait till 12 years to really start losing out. So if you think about the fact that it's an 8% annualized return, it's kind of that formula kind of thing. So it usually takes 12 years. The funny part is, for the first part of my career, I always just wrote it down for them. So really high level, and I'll kind of walk you through it. Let's say someone's going to get $1,000 a month, right? If they take it today. But if they wait till tomorrow, they'll get $1,008, right? So really easy calculation. By waiting 1 month, they're giving up $1,000 in exchange for an extra $8 a month for the rest of their life.
Huh. Okay.
So if you do the numbers, it will always come out to roughly 12 to 15 years, unless there's additional benefits to be had, like widow's benefits. So if we do, let's say that $1,000 a month, divide that by $8, we get 125 months, divide that by 12, and we got 10.4 years. But usually it does fall in that 12 to 15 year bracket. But even then, it's a simple formula, right? If I take it today, my benefits will be stuck at this level, but I've gotten $1,000. And if you pay yourself the $8 a month, how long until that money is withdrawn? And the answer is 10.4 years at that point.
Okay. That is very, very interesting. So I guess that begs the question of like, how does someone consider a lifespan, right? And like how long they think they're going to live, et cetera. Like, is it as simple as what you just explained to us? Or like, how would you talk somebody through that?
Yeah. So the first consideration, and this is where it was frustrating as just a Social Security worker, is you end up giving the person their options, but you cannot give any guidance. That was like a firm,
Right.
firm
Okay.
rule. And that's kind of where I wanted to switch over, and I wanted to actually work with the person's professional team. Like if they have a CPA and they have a financial planner, let's talk this through. And between the three of us, we can really make the best decision for this person, because you don't want the decision to be an isolated decision.
All right. So, Dennis, I totally get that. Obviously, at SSA, you could not give personalized advice. And again, we're not giving personalized advice to anybody listening, but let's just say you were talking to me, right? And so now you're out of the government, you're a consultant. How would I go about, like, what would you ask me? What would be the things that I need to consider in terms of, hey, do I even think about like men in my family live to X age? Like, is that a consideration? Like, is it my other financial situation? Is it a spousal? Like, what are even the considerations? And then, like, what would I need to bring to you or to another consultant, or if I just wanted to do it on my own, like to think through this?
So this is a great example, and this is something that we do for our clients. So the first thing is like, hey, are you under that annual earnings test? Because if you're not, it's not really a difficult decision. Either wait until you are, right? Because that annual earnings test only applies to you until your full retirement age. And then once you hit your full retirement age, then reapproach that conversation. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I would have to say is, who else would be eligible for these benefits if I file today versus waiting 4 years. So, for example, let's say you've adopted, because most of the time someone, and it's really clever how they did this because child benefits only last till 18 years old or 19 if they're still in high school. So if you think about it, most 60-year-old guys or females, their kids are already grown up. So the government doesn't have to pay the child benefits. But let's say you're a grandparent and you've adopted your kid, because adopted kids can get child benefits. So now let's say your adopted child is 15 years old. And if you take yours, yes, yours would be reduced, but now for the next 3-4 years, you could take the child benefits and you could put that away in a college fund because that's not a welfare program. And now you could basically pay for the kid's college in 3 years from those Social Security benefits. That becomes a different consideration. That it's not just about you. Sometimes it's about who else would be eligible for those benefits. And those retirement benefits, a lot of times, is significant. And the way this is a good rabbit hole to go into, what a lot of people don't understand is your personal amount, which we kind of went over, is about 3,600, right, for 2024. However, there's also a family amount. And usually the family amount is almost an additional 50%. So let's say someone who's 3,600, their family amount might be 5,700. That means the kids technically can split the difference between the 5,700 and 3,600 of $2,100 up to a certain point. So if you have 2-3 kids, that could be substantial. You could be talking about another $2,100 that goes to your kids. And think about that per month, almost on a tax-free basis kind of thing. So that's where the decisions aren't as simple as like, hey, this is really just a numbers. It's a 12-year formula. No, it's like, hey, are you working under the earnings limit? If the answer is yes, no. And sometimes, like, people don't understand. I've talked to people that are 62 years old, and after I've explained to them that they could collect benefits and then their kids will get benefits, it sometimes puts them to the situation where they're like, all right, I'm going to retire early now. And, early for the
Yeah.
regular mainstream people, not early for the FI community. But like for them, I just gave them 3 years of their life because now they're retiring at 62. They're below the earnings limit. They stop working and now they collect their Social Security benefits, and they never realized that all of this was possible.
Okay, that is fascinating. So, right, those are two things to consider, right? The annual earnings test. Are you making over? We said in 2024, it's $22,320. Obviously, that changes every single year, so that's not going to be the same number in the future. But to consider that, and then, right, do you have kids? I guess 18 or under, potentially 19 if they're still in high school. So, okay, so those are two main things. Anything else like that? I'm sure there are a million rabbit holes, so we can't touch on everyone, but any other main ones, or are those like the two main ones that you'd
And
say?
then, like you said, the health. If you have a history of males dying in your family at 66, why are you waiting till 70? Like, this money does not go into an estate. This is use it and lose it. If you don't use it, you're gifting it back to the government. So a lot of times, I guess most of the fire communities know, like, the historical, stock market returns going back till the 30s, whatever, is about 8% when you factor in dividends, if you do a total index fund. So the other consideration here is, if you feel like you're financially capable, right? Why not take it, put that money in your thing, and instead of spending it, take it and invest it at 8%. You're collecting it, but now that money is in your control, where if something happens to you, that money goes into your estate versus things. So that's the other nuance that, again, I would never give this advice, guidance when I was working for Social Security, but these are the things personally, as someone who was someone in the fire community and believes in passive income and believes in the capabilities of the community, I would think you're taking it away from the government. If you can match that 8% return, what's the value in that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Because, right, we're saying, okay, you delay, you get a guaranteed 8%. And of course, investing on your own, you can't guarantee it. But like you're saying, you have that principal then sitting there, right? So that's actually in your control at that point and could be passed on to heirs, et cetera. So, yeah, that's a massive consideration. I really like that. I guess thinking about other potential like interactions with the FI community, is there anything to consider with like your other net worth or your other accounts, 401ks, IRAs? Is there any interplay, or is it just as simple as, all right, this is my age, this is the potential income. All right, I understand what happens if I delay versus, like you said, take it out and start investing it. Like, is there any other interplay?
I wouldn't say so. It is obviously always part of a bigger financial picture of, choosing whether or not to take it or not. But I do think it's a lot simpler than some of the other programs. Like, there's no required minimum distributions, nothing like that. It's a pretty simple formula. And then the other thing I did want to kind of mention, I know this isn't exactly answering your question, is for someone who has a disabled child, when you take your benefits, depending on the amount, if your child is disabled to the point where they're never going to work ever again, they're going to be eligible for what's called disabled adult child benefits. And it's really important that they have to be diagnosed disabled before the age of 22 for them to qualify those benefits. And Social Security is kind of funny like that, because if you end up, let's say you have a 22-year-old and you're 64, 65 years old, if you could go and file for your benefits and now your child is eligible for these disabled adult child benefits, it's easier for them to get approved around the time that we're looking for that disability. So if that threshold is 22, it's easier for them to get approved at 22. Now, if you wait 7, 8 years, he's going to be a 30-year-old. So that means when they're making that medical determination, they're going to have to go back 8 years to find that he's disabled in that time period. So those are the little considerations that you really want to talk to someone that can see your whole picture and ask really good questions. Like, do you have a disabled adult child? And, we didn't address any of the welfare side of it, the SSI program. That's a whole different conversation. But those are the considerations that when you're in your 60s, you have to give. Is someone else going to be potentially eligible, especially a disabled adult child? It is critical. If you have that adult child that's never really going to work, you want to figure out how to get them those disabled adult child benefits, which would be significantly higher because it's based on the worker's earnings record, not the child's.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep. Yet another one of these just little important pieces of information for us to all just file away. And if that's pertinent to you, just really, really critical. So yeah, Dennis, I guess we have really covered a lot here. This is obviously an intro to this deep dive, but I think we did a pretty good job. Is there anything else that's like absolutely critical for part one of this deep dive into Social Security?
Yeah, Brad, thanks for asking me that. So I would definitely say that there's a common misconception about the fact that you can't work if you are receiving Social Security disability benefits. That is a huge, huge misconception. So the goal for the government is to actually try to get you off the disability benefits. So when you're filing for disability, it's probably a good idea for you not to be physically working because of the conversations we had about substantial gainful activity. Once you're actually approved, that's a whole story. So let's say, you got diagnosed with something like MS or anything, and you couldn't work for that year. You file for disability. Now you're on disability and you start taking medication. You start feeling a little bit better. There are so many incentives that the government gives you to actually go try to work. And I'll just briefly kind of mention it. So the first incentive is that the way they structured the Social Security disability benefits, and important to note here, this is not about SSI because they have very different rules, but also disability. So with regular Social Security disability benefits that are based off your earnings history, you have basically 9 months to go back to work and you will still get your full Social Security check. Now, it's important you notify Social Security and the whole 9 yards, but you could go back, feel it out. They're called your trial work months. Once you get past your trial work months, you get into a 3-year period where you're in your extended period of eligibility. Basically, if you're working over your substantial gainful amount, you're not entitled to your Social Security check. If you're under it, then you are entitled to both. So you could actually collect a salary and at the same time collect your disability. And then after that 36-month period, the first month you're over the substantial gainful amount, that is when your disability actually ceases. So it's a 45-month period of encouragement for you to go back to try to get back into stability of working. And the government also has this contract called Ticket to Work. Basically, Ticket to Work is, let's say you want to go and become a chef. If you sign up to Ticket to Work and you work with these counselors and there's vocational rehabs, they'll turn around and pay for your culinary school. You could go to like culinary school. So there's tons of these incentives to work, and so few people actually use it because they're so scared of losing the benefits instead of realizing that the benefits is a snapshot of your current situation. It doesn't necessarily have to be your situation in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. So that's the last thing I kind of wanted to try to get at, that misconception. People think just because they get it. And when they do get it, there's always a stigma to it. If you get it when you're 30, 40s, 50 years old, at the end of the day, these are benefits, especially the Social Security disability benefits that have been taken out. And like you mentioned, you weren't even aware about this disability insurance. But in reality, this is something that most people have paid into. And it's almost like, would you think twice about filing for disability that you're physically paying for separately? And the answer is no. But most people are not aware that this is included. And they're also scared of being labeled a fraud or this or that. But at the end of the day, someone has to actually find you disabled. It's not a simple process. So that kind of misconception, it's nothing to be embarrassed about. And once you're on it, it's not a lifetime thing. It could be something that's temporarily help you for the next year or two, and then maybe use one of these ticket to work programs or some other ways, and you can hopefully ease yourself off of the program.
Yeah. Dennis, that's really incredibly helpful. I think you've opened up a lot of eyes today. This is just chock full of information. I'm going to go back and listen to this at least once and write down a whole lot of things. I would say the action step, the very obvious one, is if you have not signed up for ssa.gov, go there, log in, find out what your benefits are projected at, look at your past earnings. And like we said, every year you should be logging into this. So that's like the call to action from this. And I did want to leave this. So before we hit record, you actually went out of your way to say, I'd almost, just to maintain objectivity, I would almost rather people, you didn't talk about my consulting business, but I think it's really important because you're a member of our community, you're helping people. And there might be people out there who need to reach out to somebody, and we'd rather them reach out to someone in our community. So could you mention, how somebody could get in touch with you, the name of the consulting business, if they were so inclined?
Yeah, Brad, thank you so much for opening that door. So the name of my company is Financial Security Advocates. So you could just FS Advocates, ADVOCATS.com. Quick note, just preface, if you have like a question or two, yeah, shoot it. We would never, ever, ever charge for anything like that. It's only if we're talking about like a deep dive, comprehensive plan. That's what we actually get into financial considerations for. Also, if a friend or family that needs a question asked, consider me a resource to the community. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I left Social Security. So yeah, Financial Security Advocates, fsadvocates.com.
Yeah, Dennis, that is fantastic. So fsadvocates.com. And like you said, if anybody has questions, that's an incredibly generous offer. And if you do have questions for the podcast, for round 2, for round 3, send them to me. So you can either feedback at chooseofy.com, or like I said earlier, the easiest way is to just hit reply to any of my weekly emails and just write as granular of a question as you have, because we want to answer them. Like I said, we spent 6 or 7 plus years at ChooseFI really not diving into this, and it's time that we thoroughly cover it. And now we have our in-house community member expert to help us with this. So, Dennis, again, thank you very much for being here.
You got it. And Brad, just before I leave, I posted a link if you want to share it for the newsletter, because we threw out a lot of numbers during the podcast. If you go in there, a lot of the stuff that we talked about is right there in one page.
That's
And Social
fantastic.
Security updates this every year. And they also show you the previous years. So you see everything from the amount that they're taking out in taxes, the amount that's the maximum earnings. And that's maybe a part 2 question of how that actually works. What happens after you hit the max? And you can actually see how the FICA is broken out between the Social Security and the Medicare. And then you got your quotas of coverage, you have your earnings. So that retirement earnings test, that's another way of saying annual earnings test. So that's there. And there's also 2 different annual earnings tests. One is the year you're approaching full retirement age. We'll get into that in part 2. The SGA amounts, everything right there is on one sheet. So this is a really great one to just kind of be familiar that this cheat sheet kind of exists. And this cheat sheet probably will answer 99% of questions that people have.
Yeah, Dennis, this is fantastic. I'm actually going to put this in the show notes. So for anybody who is interested, you can find the show notes on your podcast player. Just look for show notes or go to our website, chooseofy.com, and just go to podcast, and you can find the show notes for this episode. So yeah, this is a really important link. And it looks like, it's just very simply the fact sheet from Social Security.
Yep.
So super helpful. All right, Dennis, thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
Brad, honor. Thank you so much for inviting me.